This time we're going to go up to the 30,000 foot level and take a look at one of the more persistent and pervasive issues that we women face, not just here in LA, not just here in California, not even just in the US, but worldwide, and that is the gender gap, the wage gap. What we are paid versus what men are paid to do for this very same job. We heard earlier from Dr. Boutros that the gap here in California is not quite as wide as the national average, 83 cents on the dollar, but I would argue that's not good enough by a long shot. So let me start with you, Kelly Jenkins Pultz. You are a program analyst in the U.S. Department of Labor Women's Bureau. Set the table for us, if you would. Give us a sense of the factors that cause and continue to perpetuate this gap.
Great. Thank you, Tess. Economists like to talk about the wage gap and point to two main reasons that women earn less. The first is differences in education, occupation, and industry. And the second is difference in experience and hours. So let's start with the first reason. We saw some of the data that showed that women tend to work in lower paying jobs. Nationally, women make up 75% of all workers who are in the 10 top paid, lowest paying jobs. 75% of the lowest paying jobs. And we're 60% of all minimum wage workers. So already we're slightly more likely to be in lower paying jobs. And education has been great for women, but we're still more likely to major in some of the lower paying fields, such as education and liberal arts, while men are more likely to be in the higher paying fields, engineering and computer science. And we heard sort of that discussed earlier.
The STEM
right.
careers. Yeah.
Right. But even when women major in those same fields, they frequently end up in different occupations. For instance, over the last 30 years, women have made great inroads in management, business, professional jobs, but we're more likely to earn less because we hold lower paying job titles. In sales and service, men are much more likely to sell high-end items like computers and cars and devices. Women are more likely to be in low-end retail sales. Men work in protective service, which pays more than women working in personal service kind of jobs. And 25% of all women still are in administrative support, which pays much lower than some of the transportation, production, construction jobs where there are very few women.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. I think there's another plane coming aboard, so really speak loudly into your microphone if you would.
So that's the very first reason. The second reason is going to be experience and fewer hours worked per week for women. And this is where the impact of family really takes a toll on women's earnings. It's a completely rational economic decision for women who usually earn less to be the one who takes time out of the workforce when the family needs help. And Representative Kuehl had given us the wonderful paid family leave that we have in California. Thank you for that. But we all know that children take up more time over the course of their lives, 20 years at least. Children are making demands on their parents' time, and our elderly parents often need help. So women are much more likely to work less, take time out of the labor force, go part-time, and overall that impacts the fewer experience and fewer hours worked per week. But then there's one final reason that economists cannot really account for, and that's the fact that study after study shows that when you look at all these factors, there's still an unexplained portion. It makes no sense. And that's where we feel that discrimination is very likely to come into play. And it could be outright discrimination, or it might be more subtle forms of bias. But it does continue to impact women's wages every year.
So as you can see, I mean, this is there are so many factors that go into this. It is so incredibly complex. I do want to say I'm back on Twitter, so please feel free to use that hashtag again. And I want to say, so somebody's giving me a hard time for asking about everybody running for something. And so she says, I am. Maya Paley is running for the Los Feliz Neighborhood Council. So good on you. All right. let me turn to Sheila Kuehl, who I think is also going to answer this question for me. Sheila spent 8 years in the state Senate here in California, 6 years in the Assembly. Not much testosterone there, right?
Not much.
Yeah. She is currently the president of Kuehl Consulting. And are you running for office?
I am.
All right.
In case
I got a
people
yes.
don't know, I'm running for LA County Supervisor.
Yes.
Thought I should tell you.
And I think I remember the slide said right now it's 1 out of 5. Is that
That's correct. And we have an opportunity to have 2 out of 5.
All right. Given your long experience in the legislature, can you talk us through maybe just briefly some of the legislative responses that we have already seen to some of the issues that have been raised today? And then maybe 1 or 2 of the ones that you really think we should be really focusing on and trying to get something done, and for some reason it just hasn't happened yet.
Well, I think starting in the 70s, where people began to be more aware because of the women's movement, that there were differences between and among men and women, and the different economic classes of men and women, and started to think about trying to address, first of all, barriers. The barriers needed to be identified. They looked intractable. They were very serious. One of the great barriers that people had not identified in the 70s, but began to be identified in that decade, was violence against women. And violence against women got a different name as it went along. It wasn't called woman abuse or wife abuse or violence against women. It was called domestic violence. So it's sort of like food insecurity. You know, it perhaps, but the notion was we can name it and not say it's only about women. Perhaps people will feel better about it. And that was something that actually worked beginning in the 70s and 80s. You had to say, but this also happens to men. And of course, women always want to say, oh no, you should think about children first. So we had to actually have a movement that began to deal specifically with violence in the family, which was at that time hugely and overwhelmingly men against women. You have to be brave to say it because people find it distasteful. And it's the same with a wage gap. When you use the word discrimination, people want to think anything else than discrimination. So I would say for policymakers, when we began to legislate about this, we had to be honest that there was discrimination, and therefore another of the barriers that needed to be taken care of in the law was gender discrimination. And of course, Title VII went a great way towards this federally, and the states began to mimic it, but not all of them. California jumped in, and it was very good. But we needed to have expanding definitions of what it meant to discriminate on the basis of gender, because it's very difficult to prove. So we've been refining that law, and there's lots of pushback about proving that someone turns you down because of your gender. And in the courts, there were always the seesaw about whether the plaintiff had to prove it was because of her gender that she was turned down, or whether a pattern and practice of there being very few women in these jobs would be sufficient. So the law was really important. In women's health, we had many of the same issues. Women have different, let's use the word different and not be afraid of it, different needs in terms of health. Well, pregnancy would be one of them. And when the Supreme Court told the state of California that it wasn't discriminating against women if it didn't take pregnancy into account in discrimination, because although at any given time all pregnant people were women, wait for it, non-pregnant people were both. Oh, very good. And so how could that be gender discrimination? Fortunately, the Congress, which at that time seemed to have a brain in its head, said, I'm sorry. No, no, gender discrimination, we're gonna put that into the law. The other thing I think that's important is when we were talking in the first panel about being at the table, but then doing something, speaking up, it is very important not to be afraid, to be an example, an authentic example of what you're talking about. Because I was not only the first woman to be Speaker Pro Tem in the Assembly, I was the first open gay or lesbian person ever elected to the legislature, and that was a bit scary because well, you can't do it on your own, I'll tell you that. You know, I mean, I walked into my party caucus the very first day, and Antonio Villaraigosa and a whole bunch of different, John Burton, John Vasconcellos, Barbara Friedman, Kevin Murray, all came over to me and said, we don't want you to have lunch by yourself, so we're the honorary gay and lesbian caucus. And that's important as well. But when I stood up and talked about our community, when Jackie Goldberg stood up and talked about her family, there's an authenticity there that I think is important, and that is also an element. I think rather than use more time, we'll talk in a minute about where we can go next.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to ask you, you know, given that you are the only female politician that we have up here today, I mean, what do you think it is that is keeping more of us from entering political life?
Well, let me ask for a show of hands. How many of you think running for office would really be fun? Okay, I have
All right,
five.
we're drafting you.
I have 5 crazy people. As the boys say, it's all elbows under the net.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. It's harsh. It's very personal. Yesterday, someone said to me, well, have you thought of having work done? I mean, you do look your age.
No.
And I thought, great, the demographic in the 3rd Supervisorial District skews old, so I'm glad I look my age. But it's not just about looks. It's really all about the harshness of it.
Yeah.
I mean, look at our current teenage female heroes, Hunger Games and Divergent. What do they have to excel at? Violence. They have to fight. They have to be able to fight. They have to be able to kill. It is what helps them to survive. Now, they also make different choices in the course of their work, but you have to really be able to mix it up. And I honestly think a lot of women say, it's not worth it to me. It's going to put my family in a spotlight. It's very difficult. I don't know if I can raise the money. And I can tell you, you can raise the money. First of all, you just ask Mount St. Mary's for the roster of everybody who came to. I mean, if I could get it and you each gave me 25 bucks, I might be able to match my rich opponent. But that's also, I think,
Yeah.
One of those barriers.
I mean, certainly there are plenty of men who make the decision not to get into what's really a nasty arena these days.
Right,
but for women, you know, it does seem like there is a hesitancy to just even step in.
Well, I'm saying it's sort of the apprehension
Yeah.
of the fight. Now, I want to tell you one of the greatest things that happens, however, is that you find out you have 1 million friends. You have 100,000 people who really are behind you, who believe in you, especially if you're doing work that's about justice or about fairness or about equality. People come up to me I've gotten more votes in the ladies' room line at the Landmark. They just want to shake your hand and say, thank you for whatever, or for having the courage to run. So I want to say, once you get there, it's just like if you're playing in the Super Bowl, you have to run through this dark tunnel where there's a lot of jostling and, it's no fun. Then you get out in the arena and the work you can do is amazing. You never wake up in the morning and say to yourself, gee, I wonder if anything important will come across my desk today. It is so meaningful. So it's worth the race.
All right. Thank you. All right. right, Somjita, let's get your perspective now. Somjita Mitra is an economist with the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation. So studies like this are your bread and butter, right? What is the economic impact of the wage gap? You know, we know what it is on ourselves and on our families. What is it writ large throughout a city or a county?
Can everybody hear me?
Louder.
Well, first I wanted to start by explaining a little bit what economic impact is. Say, for example, we have a hypothetical example of a Jane Doe who earns $35,000 a year as a healthcare aide in Los Angeles County. Every time she gets her paycheck, she turns around and spends it on certain things, such as her rent, her groceries, maybe buying a bus pass to go to and from work. Now, her earnings indirectly support the workers at these establishments. Her earnings indirectly support, for example, the checkout clerk at the grocery store. And together, the earnings of both Jane Doe and the checkout clerk in turn support the farmer who supplies the fruits and vegetables at the grocery store. So in turn, we can see how one person's earnings really has an impact on the local economy around her. Now, if Jane Doe was actually John Doe, and I looked it up, and actually earned $46,000 a year in the same position, he has $11,000 more to spend. Certainly, he will spend it on the necessities such as rent and his groceries, but he also have more disposable income. He'll spend it on entertainment. He might buy a car. He might go on vacation. Now, his earnings actually have a significant effect on the businesses that serve him. So we can see just in just one example how important it is to kind of try to close the wage gap. And as we learned before, that in LA County, we're a little bit better off in terms of the wage gap. It's about 92 to 95 cents on the dollar, which might not sound that much until you realize that that's a decrease of about $4,000 a year on average per person. Each woman earns about $4,000 less. Now together in aggregate, that's costing LA County about $6 billion. That's $6 billion that could be recirculated back in earnings that'll benefit the economy. So we can see just in one example how important that is. If we were able to close the wage gap around the nation for all full-time working women, that increases our national GDP by 2.9%, which gives our economy $450 billion nationwide. So we can see just how important that is. This is not in terms of raising wages across the board. This is just in terms of closing the wage gap so that women are in the same position as a man is earning the same amount of money. And one of the reasons that this is important is also because there's a fiscal consequence for improving the wage gap. There's a fiscal impact in terms of what the government is spending and earning. And if we close the wage gap with the $450 billion, that's actually about 14 times what the state and federal government spent in 2012 on the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families Act. So simply closing the wage gap is one of the ways to lift women and their families out of poverty, which will have enormous consequences. If for single women, closing the wage gap will drop their poverty rate from 8% to 4%, drop it in half. And the consequences, actually the improvement's even greater for the 8.6 million households that are led by single moms. Their poverty rate, with the close the wage gap, will decrease from 29% to 15%. So we can see how important that is. It's just in terms of helping women themselves, helping their families, as well as improving the local and national economies in terms of improvement in the economy.
Let me follow up on yeah, please. Just a quick follow-up on that, because I know that part of what both of you have done research on is that because the minimum wage is so low, that affects women much more because so many of us are so many more women are subjected to the minimum wage than men are. So right now there is this push to raise the minimum wage. But the argument that you hear back is from employers who say, if I'm going to have to pay more, I'm going to have to lay people off. What is the economic response to that?
I think if there's certain rationale to that as well in terms of if businesses might have to, in the short term, there might be short-term consequences, but once enough time has passed, and simply put, if you earn more, you spend more. And if you spend more, the healthier the local economy is. So there's one of the rationales for raising the minimum wage. Actually, the fastest growing jobs in LA County are retail clerks, personal care aides, and cashiers. And on average, those jobs are about $9 to $11 an hour. Now, Dr. Glassmeyer at MIT has created a living wage calculator that says what's the minimum amount of money you will need to sustain yourself in LA County. She's done it for all the counties, all larger counties around the nation. And in LA County, the minimum wage that you need, like a living wage, is $11.37 to support yourself. So basically what we're saying is—
Just to support yourself?
Just to support yourself. So it's even higher if you have a family, which of course a lot of the single women and women households have families to support, so the wage needs to be necessarily even higher. So what we're looking at is this actually a move towards increasing poverty if we don't address the minimum wage issue, because the fastest growing jobs are not going to be enough to support the women, and most of these women will not, have families to support. So there's an economic justice issue beyond it.
And I would just like to add that businesses don't like to admit that when they pay lower wages, that they're getting subsidies for their workers from the government. And that's the dirty little secret that they don't want to admit. The President's Council of Economic Advisors had just issued a study that showed that just by raising the minimum wage to the President's proposal of $10.10 an hour would close the overall wage gap by nearly 5%. So raising the minimum wage is a huge benefit for women, and they will really make a difference for the women who need it the most.
I wanted to follow up with you as well. A question came in through Twitter. When we talk about the wage gap and why it persists, the question is the ability or lack of desire to negotiate for salaries also a factor here? And I would love to get the advice panel-wide on how to deal with that, because it's a personal struggle for me. Hate it. And I think it really is something that we're not good at it.
Right. I think that the research shows that men are going to be more likely to negotiate salaries, but the research shows that one of the reasons women don't is because they intuitively know that culturally there is a penalty for playing hardball with salary for women. It's just not a feminine behavior. We heard that on the first panel talk about, sort of asking, sitting back and waiting to be invited rather than, initiate. And so culturally for women, that is a big piece of it. And, women don't want to start their jobs with people thinking that, they're bossy or that they're difficult to get along with. They want to start on the right foot. So we know that plays some piece of it. So for women, it's learning to negotiate within these weird cultural kind of boundaries, learning how to smile and ask politely, but firmly and aggressively. And it takes a lot of skill. So the more that we can learn to negotiate, I think the first panel talked about learning to negotiate in one area of your life strengthens your ability to negotiate in all others. So it's a skill that we all need to work on.
Any notions there? And I think not, as we're talking about, it's not just in negotiating for your career, but it's just in standing up there and saying, I am here. And it's not just difficult for women, but it does seem to be something that is holding us back.
Well, I think it's an aspect of tolerance for risk. When you negotiate, frankly, you have to be prepared to lose, and you have to risk losing. That's the same thing in running for office.
Yep.
You have to say to yourself, I could lose. And often people don't like to get into a situation if they think they could lose. Secondly, women feel more responsible, especially single women with families, for other people. So that if they're risking in negotiating, they're more worried. Thirdly, women are sort of encouraged to take the edge off of any statement that they make. Men will say, I think you're full of it. Women will say, it's only my opinion, but I think you're full of it. Now, you can get to the second part, it's not quite as bad, but we're not encouraged to risk. We're not encouraged to risk physically. Many of our girls now are playing soccer. I think it's a great thing because you have to risk getting hurt, you have to risk falling down, you have to learn how to fall before you learn to fly, as Paul Simon told us. And I think that is one of the major aspects in negotiation. I had to get 41 votes for the first bill protecting people on the basis of sexual orientation. Nobody wanted to vote for it. It took me 5 years. But you have to risk asking people, meeting them where they are, figuring out what they need as well. Negotiation is not just demanding. Negotiation is smart. How are you going to benefit from my being here? And let me tell you, you are, kind of thing, you know?
Let me ask you, Samjita, again, another question from Twitter from Gen Action blog. They're wondering if you could talk about the cost of reproductive health care on women and the lack of access to it, and particularly in light of the Hobby Lobby case in front of the Supreme Court.
Well, one of the problems is, of course, that women who aren't women who earn minimum wages, or women who are earning poverty wage, that's one of the significant costs that I think the Affordable Health Care is trying to address, is just the fact that one of the things we need to pay, one of the significant costs actually, is paying for our health care premiums. And if we were to raise if we were to close the gender wage gap, that would give women enough money to pay. That would give them about, on top of everything else, about 5 months worth of health care premiums that they'd be able to pay. And I think one of the things with the Hobby Lobby, the case actually is interesting on so many levels, but in terms of religious freedoms, like, women's reproductive.
And just for those of you who may not be aware, this is the case that was argued this week, I think, where Hobby Lobby is challenging Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and saying that they should not have to pay for women's reproductive, like the pill and things like that, because of their religious objections. So the Supreme Court, that's what the Supreme Court is weighing.
Yeah, that has a lot to do, there are certain issues with that with the insurance companies. It's one of the jokes is that insurance companies will pay for Viagra, but you'll have to pay for your birth control pill. So it's just really that it goes down to in terms of what is considered important by the companies and the insurance by the employers and the insurance companies is what they'll cover. So women actually have to be proponents of lobbying their representatives, like lobbying their HRs at their companies and saying, I want my birth control covered. I want my insurance to cover me to go to the doctor, mental health care. All of that kind of comes into play, and a lot of it has to come into. It makes it difficult because, unfortunately, especially women are more likely to work in hourly jobs, and in those cases there is a problem because a lot of those jobs don't actually cover your health care. So we have an additional burden that is placed upon women who can least afford it, is that they have to, not only are they working, their hours can change week to week, but they're also having to place that burden of supporting their health insurance on top of that.
Yeah. Kelly?
So, Tess, I wanted to also tell you that, when the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, women earned about 60 cents to the dollar. Now we saw in California it's up to like 83. But over time, the access to the birth control pill has been shown to have a direct impact on how the wage gap has decreased over time. And some economists have said that just the birth control pill alone resulted in the wage gap closing by almost 30%. So definitely access to reproductive care is a huge component of women being able to work and to earn good salaries.
Okay. I know that we are about out of time. I do want to take about a minute and a half and just get from the three of you. We have, I've gotten on Twitter from both a group of female college students and some of the high school students who are here, the same question. And so I'd like you to answer it in 1 or 2 sentences if you can. What can we do to get more involved? Give them a piece of action that they can take from this room and go out and make a change in the world. Kelly?
Well, one research shows that simply putting more women in leadership positions raises the wages for women at a company. So I'd say one of the best things to do is to find your mentors, find your sponsors, champion women at all levels, and just shoot for the top.
Sheila?
I would say prepare yourself for leadership. Learn the issue, whatever it is you're going to take leadership on, and then move into leadership. Every single woman in college, every single woman in high school, run for student body president. I don't care if you think you can win or not. You know, all right. And the same is true in your office, in your neighborhood, in the PTA. I don't care what it is. Take responsibility. No one's going to do it for you. The more women in leadership, the more women on the bench. The more women in office, the more women in business. The leaders, leaders, leaders. It is not born. You're trained. Train yourself.
Samjita?
I want to suggest creating opportunities.
Her mic is not up?
Can you hear? Hello?
There we go.
Creating opportunities for yourself. When I was in grad school, and I noticed that the number of women in my econ classes was declining every year. So me and a few of my colleagues, we decided to create an organization that would reach out to women who were already graduated and professionals in their field to come and talk to us and guide us and help us figure out how to navigate this process. And the response was overwhelming. Women really wanted to help. They were waiting to help. They just hadn't been asked. So if you don't wait for the opportunities to come to you, go out and create those opportunities for yourself. Reach out and people will help you. They'll bend over backwards to help you. So
You gonna
don't
run?
be afraid.
You gonna run for office?
No, I'm gonna vote for
Kelly, you gonna run for office? No? All right, well, the question came in on Twitter, am I? And I tell you, after today, I just might. Thank you all. It was great.